Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we'll be looking at a concept which is quite common in piano playing, but which seems to generate problems for a lot of students. In other episodes, I've talked about voicing in chordal accompaniments, and how the choices we make in highlighting certain voices or individual notes within chords can help to increase the effectiveness of our interpretation. But how do we deal with the situation where the melody is in fact chordal? How do we voice this? Let's start with the simplest situation for chordal melodies, a two-note chord in thirds, or sometimes sixth. This appears very frequently in piano music, and in nearly all the cases, the rules stay the same. The top voice is the primary melody, and the bottom voice adds body and flavor to that melody. The famous opening of Debussy's Clair de Lune exemplifies this. The first step as we're learning the piece is to isolate the melodic voice and try to create an ideal version of this melody as if the right hand only had one voice to play, like this. Then, we add in the second voice, always played slightly softer than the melody, or perhaps with less percussion in sound production. Then, as a final step, we look for places where the harmonic tension is greater than normal, and then we slightly accentuate the lower voice when these places occur. Accentuation can take the form of a different sound production, or perhaps a greater volume, or even a different articulation. For instance, both the second and fourth bars exhibit more tension in the lower right-hand voice than the first and third bars, because of the dissonance potential when played with the left-hand notes. Specifically, this. The first and third bars sound relatively benign by comparison. Now, we just put it all together, and it should work somewhat automatically. The approach to playing in sixths is identical to the approach we use in thirds. Make an ideal top voice melody, and fill it in underneath. The situation gets a little more complex when we are dealing with chords of 3 notes or more, because then either we have a doubling of voices, where you have 2 notes in the chord that are the same, or you have complex harmonies that cause notes within the chord to compete for dominance. But we'll get to that in a moment. First, let's look at a very common 3-note chord configuration. The octave is perhaps the simplest way of expanding the sonic capabilities of a melody, and filling in that octave with bits and pieces is a very common pianistic procedure. In the Debussy, we have one small passage in which the right hand consists only of 3-note chords, specifically an octave plus a note in between. octaves without the middle note, the most common voicing distribution is similar to playing in thirds. The top note is the melody, the bottom adds flavor. The difference with an octave, however, is that the bottom note serves to directly reinforce the pitch of the top note. It's like giving the top melody extra body and resonance. The option exists to play the bottom voice slightly louder, thus giving the top voice extra pitch weight. But this isn't done too often, because if the accompaniment texture underneath is too thick or active, then the extra weight on the bottom voice will actually obscure the top voice. It can be done carefully when the texture is rather transparent, and I tend to weight the bottom voice at specific harmonic instances, not to be used as a general mode of playing. Now, let's add in the middle voice. In this particular sequence, Debussy keeps the middle note, a B flat, the same throughout, except for the last chord. This allows us to focus on what harmonic impact the B flat has on the chords as they progress. The first half of the sequence is relatively benign regarding the B flat's impact. The note is common to all of the chords present, serving as a fifth or a root depending on the chord. As we've discussed in previous episodes, the fifth and roots of chords, though important, do not add much tension to a given chord. And if these notes happen to be doubled, then they can be left to the bottom of the voicing totem pole in favor of other notes like thirds, sevenths, etc. Technically, this first segment could be played without the B flats entirely, and no one would be the wiser. The second segment, however, requires the B flats to take on a more prominent role, because now the B flat serves as a major third to the G flat chord, and as a minor seventh to the C chord. The B flat serves to add tension to these chords, and as a result, we have to give these notes a little more sound. Instead of playing it with a traditional voicing, say top note, bottom note, and then middle, we might shift the priorities so that the top voice drops slightly to match the volume level of the middle voice, with the bottom voice being the softest. Now, I've played these in an exaggerated fashion so that you can hear the differences easily, but in reality, this kind of shift in voicing is done at a very subtle level, and it is perceived by listeners not necessarily as a change in volume, but as a shift in the expressive power of a chord. Technically, the three-note chords we have just discussed are still voiced according to the rules for two-note chordal melodies, the only difference being the inclusion of the octave, which adds a third voice or extra source of resonance. But when we have chords of three or more different notes, we run into the problem of having to decide which notes take priority over others. The only constant rule we have for a chordal melody is that the hierarchy begins with the melodic top voice being the loudest or most percussive. Everything else must be weighed underneath. How do we determine the order of these notes? Well, it's a combination of harmonic knowledge and experimentation. Let's consider what Rachmaninoff does in his second piano sonata. The main melody of the slow movement is constructed mainly of three-note chords, and given the distribution and relative transparency of the texture, the pianist is forced into making voicing decisions that are painfully exposed to the scrutiny of the listener. consist of a sixth interval with a note in between, like these. Other chords are a little more complex, with 7th or 11th notes in them, like these. But in all the cases, our first step in voicing remains the same as before with simpler chords. Voice the top as an ideal. Once this is set, then we can start experimenting with the rest of the voices to see what sounds better or worse. When it comes to simpler chords, like inverted triads, I tend to voice first to the melody, then the bass, and then the middle. I find that it really suits the way the chords resonate, and in practice it seems to allow the chord to sound full and yet transparent. For more complex chords, however, it's sometimes necessary to try out combinations to see what notes create the most tension within the chord, and where they are placed. If a note that creates tension is placed near the melody, we almost have to pull it back slightly, so as not to obscure the melody. If the note that creates tension is placed far away from the melody, then we can allow it to resonate a little more freely without worrying that it'll gum up the works. One has to experiment with this, because there are many factors which contribute to this problem, including what other notes are being played in the accompaniment, or what dynamic you're playing in, or even if you're using the una corda pedal. It's very difficult to actually set rules about voicing on the piano when you're dealing with complex chords. In my experience, each individual case is subject to breaking the rules, which means that no matter what, we're still left with the responsibility to experiment with different voicings in order to find the ones that seem to communicate our intentions in the most direct or efficient manner. A single note voiced in a special way can make a chord sound miraculous, but if one chooses that note poorly, the chord can sound out of place, or irrelevant, or even ugly. It's a difficult process, but it's one that we must all learn. So, until next time, keep practicing and give some much needed attention to your chordal melodies. I guarantee you, they need it. Bye for now.